Beautiful. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Reparations June at M4BL and to our first piece of programming, which is a panel about reparations. We're super excited to have an incredible lineup of folks who have approached the issue of reparations from climate and land justice to philanthropy to the war on drugs to thinking about the kind of holistic picture and really fighting for literally decades now using different tactics. So we have an incredible panel ahead of you. I'm going to do some housekeeping to get out of the way. And then a kind of a brief grounding in what M4BL thinks of as reparations and where that history and lineage comes from. And then we're going to spend most of our time just talking with this incredible group of panelists. So for housekeeping number one, we have two incredible ASL interpreters who both will be throughout the panel, will be interpreting for us. We also have closed captioning available. So those are two different options. We'll do brief descriptions of ourselves before we begin as part of the ASL interpretation. We don't have a chat function tonight, but we do have a question and answer function. So please put your questions in the Q&A. We both will say those out loud, but folks can also answer the questions offline or online for you. So please feel free as we talk to be putting questions in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end. We'll do kind of one round of questions, and then we'll do audience questions, and then we'll come back for some closing remarks and thoughts. And that's most of the housekeeping. This is being recorded, so it will also be available after the fact for folks. So let me start. My name is Marbre. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a light-skinned Black woman with my hair is up in a high bun ponytail, and I have on earrings and kind of a greenish gray jumpsuit this evening, and I'm sitting in a room full of books. And I am calling in from Brooklyn, New York, and I'm super excited to be hosting and moderating tonight's panel on reparations and the legacy of reparations. This is our third or fourth annual Reparations June, where we take the time throughout the month to celebrate the ongoing fights and organizing for reparations, but also the long legacy and history of folks who have made real and possible this moment when we are across the board from local to national and international fights, fighting and winning reparations. And so we want to take some time to both honor that lineage as well as to highlight and elevate the incredible work that folks are doing today, which is what this panel is really all about. So I'm going to start really quickly with a brief history of reparations, of what it is and what we think it isn't, as well as a really kind of short honoring of some of our ancestors who have come before and the organizations that have made this moment in reparations really possible. And then we're going to jump into the panel. So when we say reparations in the dictionary, it often just says reparations means to repair something. It means to make something whole that is not whole. And so according to the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations, which is an organization that we really build a lot of our work on top of, and that continues to do so much work to advocate for reparations nationally and locally, reparations is a process of repairing, healing, and restoring an injured people. And those groups injured have a right to obtain that which they need to repair and heal themselves. And so key to this definition is that reparations really is ultimately defined by those who have been harmed, that people who have done the oppression, whether it is governments or corporations or families, don't get to decide what repair looks like. It is actually those groups who have either survived or not survived decades, sometimes generations of oppression, that get to decide what constitutes reparations. However, there is a long-standing tradition in international law of reparations that we can see that's happened from Germany after World War II to other examples like South Africa after apartheid to Canada. And under this definition, there are 5 key components of reparations. And we at M4BL use this because we want to really make the point that reparations is not just about an apology, it's not just about money, that it actually is a more comprehensive and holistic attempt to make a people whole after systemic and systematic injury and harm. So the 5 different components that the UN uses that we've also adopted, number 1 is non-repetition. So for reparations to be made good, for them to be meaningful and real, you have to stop the harm. And this is a really big one. You can't continue with policies that enslave, kill, sterilize, destroy and degrade our environment, continue to have police brutality, and say that you're repairing the harm, that as long as the harm is ongoing, reparations are impossible. So the first component of reparations is that you have to put in place policies and practices that guarantee non-repetition, that ensure that we don't continue to be harmed by the state or corporate or individual actors. Number 2 is compensation. This is kind of the traditional cash money that we think about. Reparations includes an assessment of the harm and damage damages and financial compensation for those damages and harms. It also includes restitution. This is that you try as best as possible to reestablish the situation that existed before the harm was caused. We know that for many of the harms done against and inflicted on Black people in this country and globally, that's impossible, right? We can't reclaim our homeland after we've been enslaved. We can't get back our children after the government takes them because we have marijuana possession. Some of these things are actually incurable. But to the best of the ability of the government, they must reestablish the condition we had. So this might be things like citizenship, your right to vote, your apartment, things like that. Next is satisfaction. And this means making amends, acknowledging the wrong, and honoring those that were harmed. And this can be in the form of an apology, but it also can take the form of memorials, of museums, of cultural centers, of curriculums, of really making sure that folks understand what happened and that we have an honest telling of that history. So this is really the battle over how we tell our history and if we're honest about the harm that's been inflicted and what happened. And then lastly is rehabilitation. And this is supportive services that help make people whole, whether that's legal support, psychological support, healthcare services. It's making sure that those who have been injured are actually being rehabilitated in the present moment. And so these are the 5 components that for all the reparations campaigns we've tried to support, we think about, and we try to map out. We try to make sure that it has each of those components as part of it, that it's not enough to just give someone cash money or just to say you're sorry. The reparations must include a holistic attempt to make a people whole again, which is psychological, which is about status, but is also about compensation. And so that really is how we approach reparations in different ways. Reparations is systemic, it's multifaceted, and it's both forward and backward looking. It is not a donation to a Black charity. It is not giving someone a GoFundMe account. It is not giving money to things you should already be funding, like education or healthcare. Those are not reparations. Those are good policies. And that's a difference we want to kind of make clear as we think about how we can really invest in reparations. We also want to make clear that reparations does not come from a scarcity mindset. We don't think that by demanding reparations for Black people, we are undermining the demands of Indigenous people or others for reparations. We think that actually a government that is looking forward towards racial equality and justice is repairing all of the harms it's inflicted. And so we believe that all demand is not about undermining other demands and comes from a mindset that in fact, what is due is owed. And I think we build this tradition of reparations at M4BL on a really long, beautiful legacy of reparations. So as I said, reparations is an international framework we've seen after major wars, such as World War II, reparations being paid by governments. But here in the US and in the diaspora, there was a really rich and robust history of Black people across the globe demanding reparations. And this actually starts before the end of slavery. And so there's a very famous case of Belinda Sutton, who successfully sued for 40 years of back wages before the Civil War. And one of the founders of Harvard had to pay her for those 40 years of back wages. But we also see as soon as slavery is over, both in the US, but also throughout the diaspora, folks demanding reparations for slavery and enslavement. And so here in the US, the kind of 40 acres and a mule was a movement that took hold across the country. But we also see folks in the Caribbean, in Africa, and throughout the diaspora, South America, demanding a repairing of the harm, of the generational harm of slavery and colonization. And so there are robust movements that we are growing from and learning from even today. The kind of mother and the origins of the kind of modern reparation movement we can see in Queen Mother Audley Moore, who founded the modern day reparations movement in a mass organizing way. And she sought over $36 million in back pay. She demanded jobs and job programs for Black people who were formerly enslaved and their families and loved ones across the US. In 1969, we saw a movement by James Forman and other STIC members demanding reparations from white churches and synagogues for the harms that they had inflicted on Black people. And so there was a long movement of demanding reparations, both from governments, but also from corporations, from organizations, and from churches. And so from anyone who's benefited from systemic oppression, we can see a demand for reparations and for repair. In 1987, a number of organizations came together to found the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA, which was the organization that really pushed for and has done incredible work as an example of what reparations can be, and has demanded not only reparations through HR 40, which is federal legislation, but also locally. They also explored the use of the courts, and we have folks on this call who were part of those efforts to try to figure out whether it was legislatively, through policy, or through media, how do we best secure, and sustain a reparations demand. The demand for reparations has been brought both to domestic courts, but also to international tribunals. And so through the 60s, and then most recently, after the police brutality in Chicago, organizations have demanded the UN reparations. And so this panel full of amazing organizers demanding reparations for land, justice, philanthropy, the war on drugs, and other things comes to you by way of this legacy of the organizing of hundreds of thousands of Black people across the diaspora who have said, we cannot move forward if we don't look back first. And so it's incredibly exciting this June to be having our 4th annual Reparations June and this conversation on reparations. So I will stop there with the history lesson and dive into the present and the amazing work that's happening today. And I'm going to just start with having each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves. You could just say your name, your pronoun, what's the work that you do, and what is unique about the reparations framework in your work? Why is it important that we use that? And I'll start with Tamara.
Hello, everyone. My name's Tamara Tolles O'Laughlin, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm calling from the Canarsie Lenape lands, also known as Brooklyn, New York. And I am a part of the climate face of the conversation around reparations. So for many who have done this work for decades, calling for political representation and a movement of resources towards this work, there's a particularly planetary focused version of that, because climate reparations is a framework that is an extension of the work on reparations, recognizing that it's taken every single one of the 12 million bodies that were taken from our homelands to clear the lands we currently live on in order to take the lands from our indigenous siblings and turn it into everything that exists as current capital, every institution, every kind of institution, and any byproduct or derivative after that all came from the labor of Black bodies. But it also began to directly reshape the land, change the relationship of stewardship, and make it so that Black bodies cleared trees to create industry, who had the resources from our bodies turned into the current capital that financed a revolution that destroyed the lands that we are currently on and set forward one of the largest aggressors in terms of environment, energy, air, water, access to resources, and put us on a conveyor belt that ends in a fiery gas ball. And so flagging that the long-term work of recognizing the harm to Black people from removal and our forced labor means recognizing that that labor ended in circumstances that not only were we architects against, because even as laborers, we fought back against practices of land clearing. Even as agriculturists, we fought for in the institution of slavery, we fought for practices that would not take away from the soil and the land, that would instead restore it, and had those efforts rebuffed as a part of continuing to grow things without thinking about putting back into the ecosystem. So as people who have long been the stewards of these lands, even by force, we were still trying to push for things that were restorative rather than extractive. And so the modern day call for climate reparations is about creating a financial framework that recognizes that our siblings that are being evicted from nation states by fires and floods are victims of another form of harm that has to be repaired, care and repair through reparations. That folks who are being forced to take up industries that abandon making capital in the United States, because we have proven again and again that that kind of toxicity really is an engine for destruction, like partnering across the globe for clean air, clean water, the right to grow food that we want, the right to have access to seeds and labor and land that is not spoiled, is the work of climate reparations. The other piece is that because climate is about ending the fossil fuel industry before it ends all of us, it is embodied in current fights we're having, including Cop City. So as we are speaking, our relatives are fighting a war to protect the ecosystem from over policing, quite literally, from the policing of our bodies and the use of economic power to destroy our voice about what we mean when we say stewardship. And so all of this fits under the umbrella of climate reparations, dovetails really nicely with the long arc work of reparations for harm, and matters so much that it precedes so many of the other struggles because the planet is just not going to put up with us. Like at this point, we either fight for the planet or we are ejected from it. And so building a framework to support those of us who are stewarding it with our bodies, our lives, and our futures is the next part of the work for anybody who's serious about climate and environment. Emissions matter, but if we don't deal with the false solutions, the lies that are being told, and move the money towards people who in their body and their bones and their DNA for millennia have stewarded the earth, we are not on a trajectory for success. And there's a lot to say there, but I'm super excited to hear from all the incredible folks in this conversation.
Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna go next to Jelani.
Hey everybody, I'm Jaylani. I use they, them, and theirs pronouns. I right now I'm with Law for Black Lives, and I've been the reparations coordinator there for the last year. Just to do a description, I'm a lighter skinned Black person. I'm wearing a Black shirt with a brown long sleeve cardigan. I had to look at my camera. I was like, girl, I don't know. With a brown long sleeve cardigan, and my hair is pulled back. And so in my capacity right now with Law for Black Lives, I have had the pleasure of helping to coordinate the M4BL Reparations Working Group, where I met a number of the lovely folks who are on the panel right now. And I've also spent a lot of time supporting different groups across the country who are planning reparations campaigns or actively immersed in them, including campaigns around the war on drugs, around the family policing system. And then there are also folks who are doing, divest, invest, and other campaigns like that who are interested in talking about what it means to restore harm broadly, even if their campaign is not expressly a reparations campaign. And so really just honored to be in this space. And I also just, a lot of what Tamara said resonated. And so I'm just like chewing on that. But I had also just wanted to name how much I think people really, really appreciate the international law human rights framework and the work that I have done, particularly around this element of cessation and non-repetition. And, as being abolitionists, I would like to think most, if not all of us in this space are. I don't want to project my politics onto other people, but particularly as abolitionists, I know that on the ground, with that being the trajectory of movement, there's just a lot, like a really huge opportunity for us to really lean into that and describe with a lot of particularity what that means if we're going to talk about reparations. Like, what does it mean to actually guarantee the end of anti-Black harm? Just because, at least for me, like, I don't know what that is with, like, all the details, all the I's dotted and T's crossed. And so I really, really have just appreciated the opportunity to really get into a detailed approach to the future that we believe that we deserve, and the one that I would like to think that we're building together. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. So powerful. I'm gonna go to you next, Timmy.
Thanks. Hey, y'all. So my name is Timmy Bennett. I am light-skinned Black woman with a short curly fro and a side cut with parts. I am from Chicago, but I've spent the most of my adult life in DC, so I claim both cities at home. As home, I am a pro-Black Pan-African woman trying to aid Black people. And so I am the co-CEO of IF, a Foundation for Radical Possibility. We're a private racial justice foundation centering Black people and people of the global majority. We're in DC, but we fund in the region. So those are the lands of the Susquehannocks, the Anacostians, the Patamonkeys, and the Piscataways. And our vision at IF is that Black people and people of the global majority live powerfully, abundantly, and beautifully in self-determined, healthy communities, free of social, economic, and ideological violence. And when it comes to reparations, I agree with all the definitions that's been given prior to me. In short, it's the payment of a debt owed, it's the atonement of a wrongdoing. And in this framework, when I talk about reparations, I am specifically talking about the 404 years of collective harm to Black people by both federal, state, local governments, private industry, and individuals. Happy to be here.
Yes, like Ashe, amen. Thank you for that. And then last but not least, Nikichi.
Thank you so very much. I'm Nikichi Taifa. I am a beautifully, deeply melanated Black woman. I'm sporting a t-shirt that says Reparations and Prison Abolitionists that I got at a conference a while ago. In fact, I got about 2 or 3 of these, so I always love them. In my background, I have poster boards of two of my books, my memoir, Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice, and Reparations on Fire, How and Why It's Spreading Across America. I am a native Washingtonian. I have been involved in the reparations movement since I was a teenager, and now I am an elder, and it just gives me so much delight to be in the presence of so many people now today, talking about this history of issue of dealing with reparations. We are history in the making right here, right now. Woo! I salute the work of Movement for Black Lives and Law for Black Lives, and making sure that this issue has reached another generation, okay, because that's how we carry on. That's how we pursue and keep going. I acknowledge my reparationist ancestors from Belinda Sutton Royal and Callie House to Queen Mother Audley Moore and Imari Abubakari Obadeli. And I mention Imari Obadeli because many people don't really realize that the issue of reparations and the highlight of it that we see today comes out of the Black radical tradition, the tradition that people try to sweep under the rug. It comes out of the Free the Land movement, okay? And Imari Obadeli issued the call in 1987 to establish, to mainstream, shall we say, to seek to mainstream the reparations movement, because prior to that time, it had been on the fringes. And it would say, well, we won't just say those who consider themselves citizens of the provisional government of Republic of New Africa can be the only ones to talk about reparations. We want to expand it out to the sororities and the fraternities and the churches and the civil rights organizations and the academics and the like. And so in COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America was founded in 1987. I was honored to be at that founding convention, but I had been involved in reparations for several decades prior to that. With respect to your question as to what makes reparations unique for us right here, right now, well, I would say that what makes it unique for me is that the remedy is not limited to the harms from the enslavement era, but for its lingering impacts, its vestiges, its living legacies, which manifest today. And the sister talked about climate injustice, and that is one huge area that is really just coming into the fore, but it always should have been there, because again, that's a vestige from the harms of the past, the illegal kidnapping, the cultural assault, the force-free labor, the peonage system, sharecropping, the Black codes, lynchings, the mass murders, the health disparities, the educational inequities, and the mass incarceration, all of the above, those harms, they all were multifaceted. They all still exist within the collective genes of Black people in this country. So I always say that the harms from the enslavement era and beyond were multifaceted. Thus, its remedies must be multifaceted as well. A reparations settlement can be fashioned in as many ways as possible to equitably address the innumerable consequences from the enslavement era as it can. So again, I'm glad to be in this space. Thank you for inviting me in. I'm a founder in COBRA, but I'm representing here my own organization, Reparation Education Project, that works in tandem with many of the groups, including very closely within COBRA as well.
Thank you so much for both taking us to church for a moment, but also for bringing Imari and like the legacy of N'COBRA into this room. There is a link in the chat now for folks for a conference that's coming up in June, if folks can make it, to continue the conversation with N'COBRA. So thank you for that, and Nkechi always for the energy and the walk. So I'm going to start with Tamara, you around climate and land justice. You touched on this in your intro, but I think a lot of people think about environmental justice as a separate issue from policing and racism in the kind of political imagination. But as we're seeing with Stop Cop City and fossil fuel companies using police to protect their property, the two are inexorably linked and nothing is separate. Can you share how your work challenges this kind of siloing narrative around environmental justice being in this corner and racism being in this corner around police violence?
Sure. So one, I want to correct an error and describe myself for our community to make sure I'm being really clear. So I am an African American woman with short, tight, curly, black, and a little bit of gray hair, with giant dimples that allow me to say things that are hard to people pretty regularly. Um, I am my background has a lot of trees behind it, and it is um, uh, a space in the woods where I was just like a couple of days ago. To answer your question, I think it's important to recognize that we have never been separated from the work of the earth. The creation of earthwork as a job description, as a way to make money, became something that was isolated from how work actually happens. So from the labor in our bodies to the policing of our bodies, that policing becoming an industry that is at this very moment in a struggle with folks who want to be able to have the earth be in balance, and small pockets in the world, given how much of it has been industrialized, is bubbling up at this very moment in Cop City, because the interest of folks who want to make money at all costs, including aligning themselves with polluters who ultimately would want to destroy every single thing that lives on earth. Anyone who could side with those groups is siding against earth and everyone on it. That becomes political when we're literally in a moment where, in order to build a police training facility, they will destroy a forest in the middle of the largest climate crisis in our history, or in the history of the world, since the asteroid crashed into the planet Earth. And so if at this moment we're thinking about defense and forces and fighting instead of seeds and air and water, and are willing to kill to keep that status quo, the politicization of nature, of people's access to it, of being able to fish for food and hunt for it if that's what you choose, to be able to grow and harvest things with your own hands, to build from the land and to raise your family on it. These are natural rights. These are not esoteric radical concepts. And so the idea that industry would align with policing is just like slavery and overseeing. Like we're not in a different conversation. We're in the next generation of a long conversation about who has the right to determine what the future is going to look like, what kind of investment we're putting in either into growing people or growing prisons, and whether or not we want to be wedded to a system that has never served Black people. And so this moment of upheaval and unrest is another striking example of just how far racialized capital will go to keep the status quo, even when it blatantly doesn't make sense. So the struggle for folks, family, friends who are actively fighting for their lives, risking arrest, being shut down for getting people out of jail, isn't just about one plot of land. It's about our future and our future right to be able to enjoy unspoiled earth, unspoiled air, water, and have health, which can only be achieved if the inputs that you're experiencing are not chemicals, are not poisons, are not toxins. And so we are quite literally in a period where the earth has exhausted so many of its natural resiliency that we are in a confrontation with forces who just want to make money and will do that at any cost. And so from the struggle for whose narrative will win out, the votes being cast in the city council on whether or not that project will continue, and then Black people putting their bodies on the line to say, we have a right to breathe, we have a right to eat, we have a right to live, and we have the right to pass land on to our children. We have a right to be in sibling relationship with our Indigenous family, and to call for Black equity in the face of whatever is happening with the land, but to have a right to make those choices because we know what we're doing, and not to cede all of that over to oppressive forces who want to turn everything into a saleable commodity. So this is a tough moment in the middle of ecological crisis that could care less about our politics. And the least we can do as people who have stewarded the land, whether we were in this part of the world, in Turtle Island, or we were in our various home and ancestral lands, like these fights are happening for climate reparations. If you live on an island, there are no islands in the Caribbean that are not currently in a demand for reparations, which is tied to climate because of the loss of ecology, the loss of species, the loss of plant life. All of this changes how you live. So these fights for planetary survival are directly about protecting our culture, being able to be stewards of our own future and to determine our own destiny unmolested. So I wish it was just about hugging some trees. Like there are trees to be hugged, but the livelihood and roots that those trees depend on is the soil that we live our lives in, whether we live in a city, whether we live in a field. And by the way, since we built the city out of the field, we have a right to that too. So here to bond and connect with anybody who is willing to be very clear that there are no separations between us and the environment, only what we're willing to give up for politics. Thank you.
So powerful. Thank you so, so much for that. So I'm going to Jelani about the war on drugs, which I think is another deeply connected area as well. And so the harms of the war on drugs are very far-reaching because that is how it was structured and designed. I'm curious, could you talk about some of the harms that we're experiencing from the war on drugs and criminalization today to help us frame what reparations might look like for that fight?
For you, of course. So what I didn't say in my intro is that the areas of law that I tend to gravitate towards are family law. And also before law school and I guess becoming a lawyer, I did a lot of reproductive justice organizing. So I tend to think about the war on drugs and drug criminalization through how it impacts parents in particular. And so I just wanted to offer the fact that the first person in the US to ever be convicted as it relates to like using drugs during pregnancy, well, cocaine specifically during pregnancy, let me not lie, was this 23-year-old Black woman named Jennifer Johnson. I don't know how many folks are familiar with this history. And so at trial, Jennifer was found guilty of delivering a controlled substance to a minor based on this Florida prosecutor's argument that in the like 40 seconds from when this baby is born and when they cut this umbilical cord, that's where the transfer of drugs happened. And so ultimately, Jennifer is convicted. She's sentenced to 14 years probation after she completes like a drug rehabilitation program. And one of the conditions for her probation that I think is worth raising when we think about the harm of the war on drugs for parents is that she wasn't allowed to associate with people known to or suspected of using drugs. And so in the context of the war on drugs, like that's just Black folks, like that's Black people. Just because the reason that a lot of these cases came forward is that like Black women in particular were giving birth to babies and doctors were drug testing them without their consent, which still happens. And so that's just Black folks. That's saying, you know, no, you're not in jail, but you're essentially still going to be isolated from your community in this way. And she also had to notify the state if she became pregnant again and had to do like a court specific like prenatal program. And so if she violated that, she would then be incarcerated for like 10 years or something like that. And so fortunately, in Jennifer's case, this conviction is overturned like 3 years later in I think 1992. But by that point, some 160 other people had already been arrested and prosecuted along the same, line. And only 19 of those people like pled not guilty. So again, thinking about the climate, these people's, public defenders probably were like, you should just plead guilty to this because this is just what we do to people who are suspected of or who do use drugs. And so I offer this case to really make sure that people are thoughtful about what the harm is with the war on drugs, because I think people very flippantly are like, incarceration or you get racially profiled and talk about these things as though there are not like full experiences that people have. And obviously this case did not end, in prison, and many of them do. So this is, harm up until that point of prison. And it's still, egregious and awful, and led to a family separation and led to someone experiencing the trauma of trial. And like the argument is just horrendous and awful. But incarceration, which is how most of these stories end, like also separates families and can permanently traumatize them. It's also about, the social and political rights that incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people experience. And there's no, shortage of writing to that end. But also as somebody who is a Black trans feminist and who's, remains grounded in reproductive justice, I also had wanted to situate the criminalization and restriction of access to abortion pills and to estrogen and testosterone for gender affirming care within that same context of the war on drugs, because these are also drugs that this war is being waged against, even though, it is a bit different. But I think that the war on drugs in that way can be instructive, just because what we do know from, the late 70s and early 80s is that criminalizing anything, but especially drugs, does not make them go away. And in fact, the purpose of the war on drugs was not, to make drugs go away or to actually help folks who do want to manage their relationship to drugs if they themselves feel like it's problematic or addictive. It's always been about attacking and surveilling and, incarcerating and separating Black people and other people of color, immigrants, poor folks, grand trans folks, disabled folks, all of us who are uniquely, marginalized. And so I think that when we're going to talk about that harm, there's a lot to unpack, and we can't just be kind of flippant about it or, take growing attitudes about marijuana for granted just because there are still folks who are locked up for marijuana, even as this industry expands. And then there are still folks right now, particularly Black folks, who cannot participate in this industry the way that a lot of white folks are able to. And I think it goes back to a lot of what Tamara said about the land. Like, Black folks have been planting marijuana forever. Black folks have been doing a lot of things forever that we're not allowed to do without criminalization or surveillance, but especially as it relates to land and agriculture. And so I definitely just, again, resonate with everything that Tamara said, but especially around participating in the marijuana industry and thinking about like drug criminalization broadly. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much for that, Jelani. I'm going to go to you, Timmy, next around philanthropy. So people often think about reparations as the responsibility of the government because so much of the systemic harm we've suffered is at the hands of the government. But can you talk a bit about the harm that philanthropy has also caused Black folks and our communities and their responsibility in fixing it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mentioned earlier, it's not just philanthropy. It's not just government that has caused harm to Black people collectively. It's also other sectors and industries. And we believe that government owes reparations to Black people. And if you're in DC, June 15th is the first hearing for the Reparations Task Force for the District of Columbia. So please come out and make your voice heard. And when I talk about philanthropy, and when we talk about philanthropy, I'm really talking about institutional philanthropy. So to level set, I don't mean like giving circles or things like that. I mean private and public institutions whose wealth was amassed and like are mostly endowed. They are endowed and held in markets for the most part. And so philanthropy, institutional philanthropy was created in the 1913s, 1917s as a tax haven for like white wealth. And your rules to keep your like charitable tax status and tax exempt status is to give out 5% of your wealth every year in charitable goods. That's institutional philanthropy. And that's what created the nonprofit industrial complex, right? You have nonprofits getting funding from philanthropy and then serving the people, right? And so the question is like this accumulation and mass of white wealth in this country, of course, Black harm, it was built on Black harm and BIPOC folks and other people of global majority harm. But when we talk about reparations and philanthropy, I am specifically talking about the extraction of Black labor and genius to build wealth that created these endowments of private foundations. And so we have a philanthropic reparations project in partnership with the National Committee of Responsive Philanthropy, which is pretty much the watchdog of the sector. They're viewed as an objective organization. And so we are attempting to acknowledge the glass house that the sector is in, right? That philanthropy lives in. And so, yes, we want government to pay reparations. Yes, we want private individuals to pay reparations, but we also have to account and reckon with our own wealth as a sector. And so our reparations project is the study of our endowment and the endowment of 7 other foundations in the region to quantify what you can quantify, right? Because there's some Black harm that you'll never be able to quantify. But how can we develop a methodology to actually quantify how much of that wealth came from extraction and Black harm? And hoping that when those reports come out, those wealth history reports come out, these foundations will engage in a redress and repair process and also support national movements for reparations. And so the foundations that are in this study is 8 of us. It's our endowment. It is also three other categories of foundations. The first category is foundations that have the biggest assets in the region. The second category is foundations that are specifically tied, their wealth is specifically tied to Black harm, right? So thinking of like private actors who made their money through economic development and the sweeping of like eminent domain of like Black neighborhoods to create, development. And so then the third category is foundations that have explicit commitments to racial equity and racial justice, and knowing that like reparations is a part of racial justice and racial equity. And so that's our Foundation Reckoning project. And we hope it's a pilot. The wealth history reports will be published in September, and we're hoping that other foundations will take that methodology and do it for themselves. And we are hoping that people will reckon with their own institutional harm in their origin story.
Thank you for that, and also for the kind of context and history. So I'm going to go to you, Nkechi, next, and ask you to kind of zoom out. So we talked a bit about these kind of sectors, whether it's the war on drugs or climate and land or philanthropy, which are all deeply connected. But what is kind of the state of the broader movement for reparations right now? Where are we at? Where have we been? Give us a little bit of the tea.
All right. Thank you so very much, Marbury. I would say that the quest for reparations for the descendants of African people enslaved in the United States is being recognized now as a legitimate concept. It has entered the mainstream, and it is finally being seriously considered. Talk of reparations is no longer fringe. It is now front and center. There are multitudes of organizations, faith, sororities and fraternities, professional and social justice groups, civil and human rights organizations, just the list is endless, advancing the issue of reparations. Congressionally, the HR 40 legislation that is being led by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee now is joined with a Reparations Now resolution from Congresswoman Cori Bush. The state of California is right now engaged in the historic hearings, having established a statewide reparations task force patterned directly off of the HR 40, the federal reparations bill that was originally sponsored by Congressman John Conyers. You have the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, the state of Massachusetts, not very far behind California in terms of establishing their own statewide coalitions. You have local jurisdictions across the globe. Pop, pop, pop. I mean, it's like people, legislators, policymakers are enthusiastically establishing reparations commissions, reparations task forces, looking at the abuses in their own backyards. It even was mentioned, and I'll be testifying next week before the DC City Council on Councilmember Kenyon McDuffie's reparations bill. Most folks don't realize that reparations were in fact paid in the nation's capital after the enslavement era. However, the funds were not paid to Black folk. The reparations went to the former white slaveholders for the loss of their so-called property, us. And going back, before I get off of legislatively, HR 40 was a pattern directly off of the Japanese American redress bill, which had become law in 1988, a year after NCOBRA was founded. So NCOBRA worked very closely with Congressman John Conyers and say, well, look, if they could do that for the Japanese Americans, surely there's no reason why, if we follow the same approach that the Japanese Americans did, that it would not be able to be afforded to Black folk as well. In 1988, the Japanese Americans received $20,000 for each Japanese American detention camp survivor, a trust fund to be used to educate Americans about their sufferings during World War II, a formal apology from the United States government, and a pardon for all those who resisted detention camp internment. And they started out with a commission, a study commission to study the issue. Well, I will say, because I was there at the time, everyone was not in agreement for Black folk to start out with a commission. We said, we studied this issue long enough. It's time for what? For reparations now. But strategically, we felt if we went through the same steps and approaches that the Japanese Americans went through, i.e., establishing a commission, a federally chartered commission to study the issue, and then come up with proposals for reparations, there should be no reason why we should not be successful. Well, that was 1989 when HR 40 was first introduced. It's been over 30 years. I will say that there are more co-sponsors to HR 40 now than there's ever been in history. There's a Senate companion bill introduced by Senator Cory Booker. But now, you know, a lot has happened in these past 35 or so years. The studies have been done. Okay, the analysis is there. People are now re-raising the time. It's time for reparations now. So Congresswoman Cori Bush, several weeks ago, established a Reparations Now resolution that was introduced in Congress to actually look at what can repair actually look like, okay? So it's in tandem with HR 40. It does not supplant HR 40. It's in concert with HR 40, but it also gives a vision for just what some elements of this repair can be and look like. And in an environment when they're talking about taking history out of the schools and banning books and the like, when you look at the text of Congresswoman Cori Bush from St. Louis, her reparations resolution, you will see that it reads like a history book, like a history text, outlining many of the abuses and the trauma and the terrorism that's been waged against Black folk ever since the Ma'afa, M-A-A-F-A, the Ma'afa, the Holocaust of American enslavement and the slave trade. So then we have jurisdictions, again, you have Amherst, Massachusetts, we have Asheville, North Carolina, we have Detroit, Michigan, we have Greenbelt, Maryland, we have Boston, Massachusetts, we have Providence, Rhode Island, Burlington, Vermont, St. Paul, Minnesota, all over, pop. People talking about looking at the abuses in their own jurisdiction's backyard and seeking redress and seeking repair. We also have the U.S. Conference of Mayors supporting the issue of reparations. We have the Players Coalition of professional athletes, coaches, and owners across all of those sports leagues. We have Amalgamated Bank. Okay, many more have picked up the banner to endorse reparations. We have white ally groups who are committed to truth-telling. We even have Ben & Jerry's ice cream issuing a challenge to other corporations to collectively use their power and privilege to reckon with the past. We have the Virginia and Princeton theological seminaries. They are addressing the issue of reparations. We have the dioceses of the Episcopal Church in several jurisdictions have committed monies as a moral statement of the church's historic complicity. The financial backers of many of the country's top universities, including all of the Ivy League universities, they were wealthy slave owners. Some include Georgetown University, which stands today because of the sale of Black people owned by its founding Jesuits, announcing $100 million towards descendants that saved the university. We have Harvard University dedicating $100 million to begin to atone for its extensive ties to enslavement and the perpetuation of racial inequality. And might I add, these figures from Georgetown, Harvard, President, those figures, 100, that's just a drop in the bucket when you talk about the immense wealth that was built on the backs of Black people. Caskets are opening all across the country, uncovering evidence of racial atrocities, of lynchings, of massacres. I mean, past damages are being uncovered and redressed, such as the governmental theft. Okay, they call it eminent domain, but I would say governmental theft of the lucrative Black-owned Bruce's Beach in Manhattan, California. There are current efforts for redress from the Okoshi, Florida's 1920 Election Day bloodbath and the 1919 terrorism that ravaged Elaine, Arkansas's Black community. The land housing the unimaginable horrors of Atlanta's Chattahoochee Brick Company, which continued slavery in the name of convict leasing, is being reclaimed by the people, as what's happening in Palm Springs, California, right here today as well. There's renewed litigation to achieve reparatory justice in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where over 40 square blocks of just lucrative Black businesses and property and houses were just leveled to the ground with a bomb. I'm going to call it a bomb, was dropped on that Black community. Recommendations from with Tulsa, the 2000 commission investigating the 1898 racial insurrection and coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina, are still waiting to be passed by the legislator. I know about the Wilmington, North Carolina scenario because of a film that I saw. That's why it's so important that the arts and culture are integrated with what we're talking about here. I found out about Rosewood, Florida. I mean, found out more. It led me to do more research. Rosewood, Florida, because of John Singleton's film that he made called Rosewood. It's so very important that this history be undug up and be out there. In 2019, remnants from the slave ship Clotilda were discovered, which in 1860 illegally transported Africans. When I say illegal, it was always illegal, but this time it was illegal pursuant to the US Constitution, which basically said that the slave trade was not to continue past the year 1808. So we're talking about 1860, when Africans were illegally transported to Mobile Bay, Alabama, more than 50 years after the slave trade was supposed to have been abolished. And its descendants today are looking at the issue of amends. I just want to say, my sisters and brothers, it is a new day, okay? There is new energy and there are new possibilities. And the fruit that we see today, it didn't just drop from the sky. What happened in Evanston, Illinois, with them using tax proceeds from their newly legal cannabis industry to fund reparation projects in that jurisdiction, didn't just drop from the sky 2 years ago. There was an alderman, Judge John Baptiste in Evanston back in 2000, who had Evanston signed on to endorse HR 40. California, what's happening in the state of California right now did not just drop from the sky. Before the turn of the century, there were scores of jurisdictions across California signing on to the legislation, the HR 40 legislation. So things build upon other things. 30 years ago, over 30 years ago was HR 40, but the fruit that we see today is emanating because of the strategy, the approach that Cobra and John Conyers used back then. It didn't yield reparations, but it's dealing with all of the energy and the momentum that we see today. I just want to conclude by saying that reparations, it is no longer a stretch of the imagination or an unobtainable goal, but it is very likely a reality and achievable in our lifetime.
I don't know if you can see all the hearts and the yes and amens flowing from our Zoom screen. So I'm gonna, I think, open this question up to everybody. And this is in some ways a reflection of a question in the chat box as well. But you've talked about, Nkechi and other folks, a wide variety of tax tactics, from litigation to policy to public pressure to cultural organizing. And we're seeing across the country folks kind of take different tactics to win reparations. I'm curious, and everyone can answer this, or anyone can answer this, given where we are right now, what do folks think are the most effective strategies for winning reparations? And I see someone in the question and answer box just suggested that we get a court order to a petition to get a court order for Sherman Special Field 15 order enforced, which is the 40 acres and a mule. So yeah, just interested in what folks think. And I see tomorrow we can start with you and we can make our way around.
Sure. So I want to just lift up that we're already in a global conversation about reparations. I think that there's a false dichotomy between climate reparations and reparations when really it's the same work along a continuum. Currently, the UN, after a lot of pressure from activists and nation states, Black nation states seeking reparations for what climate is doing right now, have garnered the Loss and Damage Fund. And one of the things that is really powerful about it is that, like lots of ideas in environment, if it isn't funded, it isn't real. And so there's a call on the question right now that for folks who will be forced to evacuate because of what has already happened, who will be forced to flee because fires have changed the conditions under which they have lived their lives, there's already a space in the global conversation that has to be tied back to the call for reparations. And so as folks line up to fight for climate and to push for their climate stimmy, as that becomes more real, we have to own the fact that you couldn't possibly subscribe to climate reparations if you don't believe in reparations as a concept. So there's just so much in that work that's live. So standing up for our brothers and sisters across the globe is standing up for ourselves. And that question is live as the US is deciding, how it will fund that and how other global North countries will stand up to the call for the vehicle that they agreed to. So as we start to push the conversation around the incredible domestic legislation, we also need to remember that the farmers who didn't get the money that the United States promised them because white supremacists sued the federal government were also seeking reparations for the harm that has been done to land in the United States and the intentional act of moving Black farmers off of their own land. And so even if it is not called that we're in this conversation right now. So while I'm grateful to our ancestors, many of whom are still cute and still walking around, like calling for this, there are vehicles right this moment that regardless of what they're called, should be funded. Those mandates have to be funded. People's lives can be restored so that the next generation doesn't have to start from scratch in a world or earth that's too scorched to live on. So it would be really great if folks support the call for loss and damages. It would be really great if people, when the farm bill comes around in the next 6 minutes, show up to fight alongside of Black farmers to get the money they were promised on top of the money they're owed. Check.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to come back to you on Black farmers too, because that feels like a really important example of like when we try different strategies and the shortcomings and also the possibilities of them. Nkechi, other folks on like what is the strategy we should be using and like or the strategies implore that we should be using and why? Tell me you want to go next and then Nkechi.
Okay, sure. I mean, Nkechi talked about a lot of it is rooted in history, right? And telling the truth about the wealth and how it got there. I think that when you start calling out the intentional Black harm done, then people feel obligated to do something, right? There are organizations that today are progressive and liberal, but I don't know if folks still like specifically, for example, Washington Post, right? If you wanted to know where the lynchings were in DC, you went to the Washington Post to see where to go for the lynchings, right? But like nobody knows that history. And so until we start really reckoning and calling out the origins of how we got here around wealth extraction, then I don't think that we'll actually get until we call out people won't feel the need. I think that a lot of, particularly in the philanthropic sector, they feel like, oh, we're doing good things, we're doing grant making, and we have racial equity, and so we're giving some funds. But if you look at the funds, Black-led organizations, like there's a giving gap. We don't get the money. Black organizations don't get the resources, they don't get the funding. There was a lot of promises. I think $5 billion was promised to Black-led organizations in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And when you look at how much of that was actually paid back, it was like less than 1 billion was actually given. And then now everybody's retracting those statements. And so if we are calling out the individual actors, the individual's families, the individual history, and the institutions that created that, then there is an obligation and a duty for them to repair, just for them to save face. So that's like that carrot stick. A lot of folks aren't coming willingly. And so how do you call them out and, force them to get into the movement?
I'm so happy you said it, because I feel like this fight over our history, whether it's critical race theory or whatever you want to call it, or wokeness, is also all about what you're talking about, which is like, if we tell it how it was and how it is, then the arguments we have to make to give reparations look really different. But there's a real fight over that origin story and that history. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to you, Nikichi, and then Jelani, if you wanted to jump in, we'll go to the next round of questions.
Yes, I'm happy to address that in terms of what is the best solutions, legislative, litigative, or whatever. In my humble opinion, it's not a matter of either or, but all available strategies. And as Malcolm says, by any means necessary. Really depends on the circumstances at the moment. During the civil rights era, there was a lot of movement in terms of the litigation, and then policy change happened because people were in the streets. Okay, so it was the encirclement of all different strategies, one leading to needing to another. With NCOBA, I reached back to NCOBA because NCOBA really started is what I consider the modern era of the reparations movement, having been blessed by Queen Mother Otley Moore. Andrew Ayatollah headed up the NCOBA Litigation Strategies Commission. Okay. And what we were seeing was that there was a case that was in court, and all these cases were being thrown out on statute of limitation grounds, laches, and the like. And we say, well, how do we get a winning strategy so that we are not succumbed, by the court system and all? And that's really where we've been talking about it all along, but this is when we really mechanize the whole thing about, we're not just talking about the enslavement era, we're talking about things that are happening right here, right now, today. And then COBA came up with those 5 forms, injury classes of injury, of which just about everything that I can think of can be subsumed with them. And I think you went over them earlier, Marbury, I think you did, but that's the health and the wealth and the education and the mass incarceration. And also we talked about that peoplehood, nationhood, because again, we're coming out of the Black radical tradition. We are a nation of people, we are a separate people, and our language and our culture and our history and all that was snatched. You can't put a dollar figure on that. Okay, and so we also expanded beyond what I came up with as a teenager, cut the check, et cetera, et cetera. We matured much further along from there, that reparations can be in any way, shape, form, or fashion, that the injured parties, the class, the victims, say that it is or prove it as such. So all of the panelists today, whether we're talking about the environment and climate and the war on drugs, and my professional career was dealing with the war on drugs, and we are still I'm fighting it. There's a letter that just went around today about people signing a letter to Biden to provide clemency or a pardon. I'm not even talking about marijuana right now. I'm talking about the crack powder cocaine disparity, which still exists today. There still is not equalization between that policy that disproportionately impacted our people. And when you talk about philanthropy, I mean, we can't do this work unless there's funding. I mean, well, I really won't say that because I've been doing this work for nearly 50 years with no funding. And I got to give shout out to foundations that have stepped up to the plate. Very, very, very few, but who have been bold, okay? And have stepped out on faith, such as Decolonizing Wealth, such as Liberation Ventures. I mean, stepped out on faith when the big boys, I guess you could say, folk who have been in the trenches for a long time, who I know whose wealth, as my sister said, has emanated from the wealth that this country has unjustly gained. So in conclusion, we need all of these aspects. We need litigation. We need policy and legislative, but we also need grassroots out in the street. And I will say, I take a page from Movement for Black Lives. I just got to say, and I'm going to put it in the chat if I can. I'll put it in after I say what it is. Here we go. Education. Oh gosh, I can't even spell project.org/shop. And that is one of the things that reached the hearts and minds of people, not only across this country, but across the globe, was constantly seeing those signs in those backyards, on those lawns, and those churches, and Black Lives Matter. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing a Black Lives Matter sign. So my organization, Reparation Education Project, has some merch right now. It has lawn signs, reparations now. It has water bottles, reparation now. It has mugs. It has little jewelry bags, reusable shopping bags. And it's not necessarily for folk to go to whatever company we partner with to do that with and purchase from us. Be creative. Come up with your own reparations now stuff. In fact, do that. Don't even use it's not a money maker. Trust me, it's not. But we want to just inspire the creative juices of all types of organizations and individuals like that to show your love for this issue of reparations and display it. Because when we do that, that's when policymakers up on the Hill feel that they have a cover to be able to do what Cori Bush did, to be able to do what Sheila Jackson Lee is doing, be able to do what Cory Booker is doing, Jamal Bowman, and the other ones up there talking about reparation. Give some cover to know that their constituents, okay, are talking about this issue. And one way you can visually show it is, use it as a conversation starter. Put it on your lawn. Do a bumper sticker on the back of your cars. Anyway, that's my little plug.
Thank you, Nikichi. I'm going to go to you, Jelani, and then I'm going to try to put some questions together for us the last 15 or so minutes. Go ahead, Jelani.
Sure. So I just wanted to jump in to say, like, I don't think it's the law. Like, I think that there are practical things that can be gained through lawsuits and legislation, and I wouldn't devalue those things ever. But I know that we're not going to get reparations from SCOTUS or from governors or from electeds. Just because the future that we deserve can't be given. And if it was something that the state was willing to give us, we would have it. And like, I think, and I also am thoughtful about like what Temi had offered too, that there are private, individuals, entities that owe us something, and they can only be compelled so much like by the state in that way. I'm particularly thoughtful about that like ultimately, a lot of the folks putting money into reparations work now like are doing so largely voluntarily, and historically when even Supreme Court or like states have tried to compel private actors to change, like thinking of school desegregation, like our schools are technically desegregated now, even though they're still segregated. There's still slavery in our prisons. Like that's what it's looked like when the state tries to compel, private action, or tries to compel us to move forward and to progress. And even in the last, few terms, to stay on SCOTUS for a minute, they've just obliterated a lot of human rights just out, really explicitly. Like it wasn't a mild attempt or doing the bare minimum. They just have said we don't have those rights anymore. And that's like not just reproductive rights, but environmental protections, a lot of the protections in place for criminal defendants. And now they're expected to overturn ICWA, which would just expand the theft of Indigenous children from their Indigenous communities. And so I know that there are people who would say that the law is like the best strategy and is a strategy that we should all pour resources and invest in. But I don't think that that's true. I think that we should, use the law for what practical support we can have. And I think right now, a lot of that is like protest and bail support, making legal representation actually accessible to folks as they do this work, because I think it's going to come from the grassroots. Like it's going to come from us saying like, we want reparations right now, and so we're going to take them. And so I think lawyers' job in that space is to put our bodies on the line to the extent that we can, to keep our folks safe so that they can see the future that they're fighting for, because that's never guaranteed. And for us to really maintain that future once we get it is going to be a conscious decision every day. It's not going to be because some, judicial body intervenes to say Black folks finally deserve something or are finally worth something. And I don't think we need it. I think we know that what we deserve, and I think we should just take it. Like, I don't think that we need someone to come and, explain it to us. Also, just looking at who's on SCOTUS, like, I don't want them to talk to me anyway. So I'm okay with that.
Okay, thank you for that. And just, I think, to this point about kind of history of how much we've learned from our ancestors, of like, it's the wins have come from organizing. So I really appreciate that perspective too. Beautiful. So I'm going to ask a quick question of you, Tamara, and then open it up around some of the questions in the chat box. So there was a question specifically about whether or not and what organizing looks like in the Gullah Geechee region right now around land and climate. If that's happening, if so, what are some of the demands and what does it look like?
So the demands for representation feed into a framework. So the demand set for climate reparations is not very different than the demand set for reparations in general, because the request for acknowledgement, the request for satisfaction, the promise to do no further harm, recognizing that money is limited, all of these frameworks make so much sense when you are forced to retreat from your home because of erosion that was spurred on by fossil fuel production, by land development, by stewardship, by folks who don't know what they're doing, and your ultimate eviction from your homeland. And so there are real demands that can be made of state agencies, of the federal government, for resources for folks who choose to stay, who are forced to leave, for the loss of culture and the damages that come from being separated. Indigeneity does not belong to any group. It is about relationship to land, and our other indigenous siblings have said so. And so I do think it's really powerful for us to recognize that there are no arguments that are being advanced in those spaces that are not totally applicable to the Gullah Geechee region, to the loss of agricultural rights, land rights, stewardship rights, and cultural protection. And I know that there are many folks who are working across these spaces under the frame of climate and environmental justice in that region. So the short answer is yes, the long answer is also yes.
I love it. Thank you for that. I also think we have some Cop City resources. You had mentioned that earlier, and the kind of deep ties between police brutality and the oppression of the state and climate and land justice. So we'll drop those in the chat box for folks. There was a question around restorative justice versus reparations. I'm just curious if anyone wants to speak to that a bit, kind of how is reparations different than restorative justice? And have you seen restorative justice in your spaces in ways that either undermine or complement reparations?
I'm happy to comment. Just because I guess I would be curious to hear more always, but I think that reparations is very different from restorative justice in the ways that I've experienced it, as far as like interventions for harm that happens like intracommunally. So like me and other Black folks, other folks who are similarly, marginalized in other ways, is that it's a way of addressing harm that's more lateral than I think state violence or like violence between like these private, moneyed nonprofits and foundations. Like it's usually an intervention for lateral harm. And so I think one of the key differences is the relationship between the people involved. Like ideally to have like restorative justice process or even a transformative justice process is to have, deep community relationships that just aren't possible with the state. And that I don't think are possible with like philanthropic contributors. I also arguably don't think that they're possible in this individual sense between like me and potentially a white person who descends from a slave owner, because presumably we're not in that kind of deep community. At least for me, like I don't know who that person is. They are probably walking around, but I wouldn't know them. And so I think to try and use transformative justice or restorative justice would be a little bit awkward, probably, but also just odd. I don't think that it has room to really fully grapple with those kind of power dynamics that would exist. Though I try not to rule things out. Like I try not to say like never ever could we ever do this. Like in the example of like someone who's the descendant of enslaved folks and then someone who's the descendant of enslavers. I just personally could not imagine the deep kind of community relationship that would have to exist there. But I won't say never. But
thank you for that. I have a question for whoever kind of has an answer to it or thoughts on it, which is, there's a lot of growing popularity around reparations, and this came up a bit in the Q&A as well. And one of the major threats to that is co-option. And folks have all different ideas about kind of who's co-opting, what that looks like. But just curious for folks, what is the threat of co-option, do you think? Are you seeing it happen? And what can we do to protect our reparations movement from co-option?
So let me just start out, if I may. One way to protect against co-option is to look at history and look at the past. I'm going to address just one aspect of co-option right now. I'm not going to address things like, paying someone's school bills or something like that. I want to deal with issues in terms of issues within the movement, I guess you could say. I came out of the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where the FBI's COINTELPRO program was in full steam. It's still there now under different names and brands. But basically, this was when it was becoming out in the open, the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalists and their organizations and their leaders and their spokespersons and their supporters. That was the goal of the COINTELPRO. And it pit organizations against organizations. It put out lies and untruths, and it sought to foment distrust and even leading to physical violence and murders. Okay, so I think it's very critical that we look at the past, look how governmental agencies, tentacles of the U.S. government, sought to destroy organizations that were talking about things like reparations, and that reparations was very much in the conversation of that day, and ensure that we don't allow that to happen right now, right here, today. It is happening. Okay, and it was happening back then it happened back then with Marcus Garvey. We just didn't have a name for it, and we didn't have the proof. Well, we have the proof now with the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, calling it a war against the Black people, and it is not ended. So one way to guard against co-option in terms of those type of issues is to look at what happened in the past and do whatever we can to make sure that we don't fall victim to it now in the present or in the future.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to you, Tamara.
Yeah, I'll just say more of that. And also, I think some of the champion arguments that resurface again and again amongst groups who have been co-opted themselves into this kind of false dichotomy is thinking that they're separate. So there's nothing about Indigenous sovereignty that threatens Black equity. It is true that these lands are not the lands we came from. It is also true that nothing that exists here was built without our labor. So why would we get into a fight when we have a common enemy, right? So there's no logical reason why we should be in disagreement when the ends we seek require the same thing. That's about resources shifting over time from entities that have made money into generations that don't yet exist off of those two things being true. Fights around climate refugees as people get evicted from their lands from fire and flood and wind and heat and drought. That does not create a new part of the argument because we are not separate from those. The question of indigeneity being about land, not about people. And as long as we have a praxis and an analysis that is tied to the fact that what was taken from us is everything that exists in this space and this time, and is connected to a system that started and will have an end, it will be petty for us to get into these kind of old recycled arguments. And I can say, in a movement full of people that are composted, recycled, and returned into the work again and again and again, we really just need to be smart about how these weak arguments have wasted our energy for long enough. So just co-sign everything Catchy said.
Thank you so much for that. I think that point around like divide and conquer has been such a powerful kind of used against us. Tammy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that, but for us, when we talk about reparations, like it's not, you have to put your money and your resources where your mouth is. Like if it's not touching the Black wealth gap, and I hate to talk about it in capitalistic terms, so I'm a fan of cooperative economics, but like if it's not addressing the wealth gap, right, then the Black wealth gap specifically, then I don't think you can call it reparations. It is literally land resources, programs, all those things to enable Black people to have their own self-determined communities. And if it's not doing that, then I don't think you can say that it's atoning for any wrongdoing or repairing the Black extraction.
I love it. And I want to get to some closing comments, but I do really want to get to this question in the chat around lineage-based reparations, because I think this is a really important and ongoing debate that we've seen in our spaces. And I'm curious if folks on this panel, there's a question here in East Palo Alto. Our reparations group has decided to support lineage-based reparations, which is being pushed really hard in California. Is that problematic as we move forward? Would love folks' thoughts on that. Don't let me get to talking about this. But curious if folks have thoughts on the limitations or issues with lineage-based reparations.
I can start. Okay, so for large-scale mass reparations movements, which is what we're talking about in the large sense, in my humble opinion, the burden of proof for lineage-based reparations is limiting and is under-inclusive, precisely because of the harm from the enslavement era. Now we can say, well, you can do a DNA test. The Mormon Church has their compilation of records, et cetera. On a small scale basis, you might want to do that. And on a small scale basis, actually, I really recommend that anybody who wants to should search out their African ancestry, but to have it as a requirement for receipt of reparation in the year 2023 and beyond, it's just simply unrealistic. I know that California has been through that. They're talking about having a Freedmen's Bureau to oversee everyone taking these tests or going through their files to find out what plantation they belong to, et cetera, et cetera. On a large scale basis, I submit it is totally and completely unrealistic. There are many, many other reasons as well. But I will say this, on individual basis, it's like Palm Spring or Tulsa or Bruce's Beach or something like that, on small scale family base, where you have a direct identifiable injury, a direct who was the harm and a direct recipient, it's probably possible, but not for a large scale, in my humble opinion.
Thank you, Nkechi, for speaking to the kind of practicality of it. Curious if other folks can also speak to like other issues or concerns with lineage-based.
One thing that I have been thinking about recently, as a lot of folks wait for the final draft of the California report to come out, is that I read the first report front to back. And so when people talk about lineage-based reparations for something like that is entirely seemingly policy-based, I just question what that means. Because the way that laws are applied in the United States is seemingly for everyone. Like if they change how the healthcare system functions, it won't just be not, African Americans or African descendants of slaves, however folks want to phrase it, it would be everybody, even white folks. And so I have really struggled to indulge the argument in light of that. Like, I think that it really, to me, like puts a lot of pressure on us to talk about like what reparations we're talking about, that lineage even would legitimately be a factor if we're talking about just policy change. Like I'm personally not just talking about policy change, but some people are. Like some commissions have talked about compensation, here and there, and without really talking about like, if we are going to create lineage, how are we going to make it accessible to actually identify your roots, one? Because in some of the examples, like Evanston, for example, there are folks who were not able to apply for the housing program despite being like, I've been homeless here all my life, or, my uncle or whatever, like being like generational residents, like proof, like if I'm here, that means that I'm an African descendant of enslaved folks. And like as somebody who's also Caribbean, like they were just slaves over there as well, like both sides of my lineage. And so I just have really struggled with this argument because I also am just like, the Black radical tradition is one that's internationalist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and would not be only asking for policy change. And so I think that indulging the argument has been really difficult for me in light of my personal values and who I claim as my ancestors and who I would like to think would claim me as their descendant. And so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I appreciate both kind of tapping into that this is not a scarcity demand and the more unified knit. Okay, y'all, we have 3 minutes left. There was a lot of juicy and interesting things in the chat. I'm going to invite the panelists to answer some of these offline for folks. Really quickly, before we have closing remarks, which would be really like less than 30 seconds, like what are you hopeful about and how and where can people catch you and the file you're making? But want to just ask, I think there's a question around whether or not M4BL has kind of a list of where reparations campaigns are happening or if that exists someplace else, and if M4BL would be down to support with folks who are writing reparations. So just, I don't know if that's Jelani or who, if you want to just speak really quickly to how folks can learn more about the supports that are offered before we go into the closing.
Sure. I can just amplify that this isn't going to be our only panel this month. On the 27th is going to be one on reparations and reproductive justice specifically. And so I'll be there if for some reason you would like to spend more time with me. But also throughout the month, I know on M4BL social media pages, there'll be lots of posts, including how to access like this recording. And so I would just continue to monitor them because I know that the comms team also will be sharing a lot of like pop ed throughout the month too, that people can take advantage of and bring back to their folks where they're having these conversations.
So, and I know that M4BL is working on a resource around reparations, mapping reparations campaigns. So check out M4BL of Black Lives and follow us as well to learn more about that. Okay, y'all. So 30 seconds. What are you hopeful about, and where can people learn more about the work you're doing? And you can drop whatever social media tags you have in the chat box. But let's just do a quick round robin. We'll start with you, Nikichi. Hopeful about.
Okay. So I would say I am hopeful because we are beyond rhetoric now and well into action mode, that these times are exciting. This history is equal parts. It's edgy, it's exciting, it's transformational, it's confrontational, it's messy, and it's confusing, but it is history in the making and it's happening right now. And I am glad that I am still around to be able to witness some of it. And I'll put my organization in the chat, reparationeducationproject.org.
Love it. Jelani? I mean, I feel compelled to always just say thanks for the space and for being here. And I mean, you already plugged M4BL Marvel. So I'm just like, not to be selfish, but that is also where I am located and housed. And so, yeah, just continue to I just continue to be like really grateful for the opportunity to be engaged in conversation. Like I mentioned, I'm Caribbean in addition to being African American, and so I tried to think really expansively and robustly about what repair looks like in a Pan-Africanist way. So yeah, that's all I would like to offer.
Thank you. Temi?
Yeah, what makes me hopeful is how upset foundations are getting with our study, right? Like, to be called out is not something the philanthropic sector is used to. They're the do-gooders. And so for us, we believe that philanthropy really shouldn't exist, right? The money isn't theirs. And so I think the resources need to be freed. And our study has garnered so much anger and animosity to the point where it makes me think that we're on the right track. When white folks and white funders are upset, that means we're doing something right. So that's what makes me hopeful. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I love it. Thank you. Tomorrow I'll end with you.
I am hopeful that every day I meet new people, young people, angry old people who are very clear on what's happening to them, have no interest in going down the roads that have already been taken, and have a willingness to work across the generations to solve it. So every time I meet someone I never met before who's fired up, I feel like we are moving in the right direction, because we're not in one place. We're not calling for one thing. We're not trying to get it one way. Everything's on the table. And that is a really powerful place in this work. So I'm inspired by the community and how vast it is across the diaspora. Every time I read an article that people in Jamaica were like, no, I don't want to go to your parade. I want my money. It makes me feel good in the bottom of my heart. So like, I'm just really excited to see how far we're going, independent of each other and together.
I love it. Yes, Ashay. Okay, we are late. Thank y'all for joining us. Please follow the MFOBL Reparations June link. We'll also make sure to share all of the folks' hashtags and resources there. Thank you for coming. Thank you for fighting. And we'll see you soon. Peace out.